This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1086, a conversation with D.G. Chichester, creator commentary on Daredevil, Batman, and Daredevil, Black Armor.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1086. It's another conversation with D.G. Chichester, but this time around, we're doing a creator commentary on Daredevil, Batman, the one-shot from the mid to late 90s, as well as we're talking about Daredevil, Black Armor, recent miniseries from Marvel from 2023 to 2024. I was very excited to sit down and talk to Chichester once again to, take a bit of a creator commentary look and look at what it was like working on Daredevil Batman, which was one of the DC Marvel crossovers of the 90s, which is now finally recollected properly in a nice omnibus format. We also talk about his work on Daredevil Black Armor, revisiting a specific period in Daredevil's life. If you want to actually go back and listen to episode 1085, I talk about both these books with my frequent co-host and friend, Nathan Struck. We review and talk about what our own interpretations were of both Daredevil Batman and Daredevil Black Armor. We kind of muse about questions we had after reading it, knowing I was about to talk with Dan about his work. And then this is that conversation. So this was a lot of fun. Dan was very game and up for a conversation, and it went in some interesting different ways. I'm hoping to get Dan back soon to talk about Daredevil 297 to 300, which is referred to as Fall of the Kingpin, but at the time was called Last Rites, which has always been a favorite storyline of mine. I've always liked how, especially with 300, it really was a nice bookend to what has been put into place with Born Again by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. Anyways, this was a lot of fun as always, and I hope you enjoy the episode. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. And actually, on another note, if you were listening to the last episode and it cut off at about the 45-minute mark, you would have been one of the original people who downloaded the episode, until I was told by a friend of the show, Cody Wilson, that there was actually, it just kind of trailed off in the middle of a comment. Turns out there was 20 to 25 minutes that was accidentally not included in the original episode as it was uploaded. So that was my bad. That has now been fixed. So if you vaguely remember that it ended kind of weirdly, definitely go back and re-download that episode, and you'll get to enjoy another 20 to 25 minutes of me talking about Black Armor with Nathan Struck. Anyways, thank you so much for this listening to this preamble. Let's jump right into the episode as I sit down with D.G. Chichester to talk all about Daredevil Black Armor and Daredevil Batman. Enjoy. Dan, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. Where are you today?
Oh, thank you, Adam. It's great to be back. We all sound so official. We put on our radio voices and off we go. And as I said to you before we started running, I really appreciate the chance to get back and reconnect with you. And it's weird that it's been 10 years since I think we first talked, and I've talked in between, but great that you're still running the show, and great from my point of view to have a chance to get back on and talk whatever we want to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, I should mention, I probably will have mentioned this in the upfront intro, but for those who want to check out other conversations with Dan in the past, episode 304 from September 2015. Oof, that's a long time ago.
I know.
And episode 1003, so you were one of the first few episodes after I came back from my year-long hiatus, so that would have been back in August 2023. Now, I'll get back to that one. That one was an interesting one because as I was coming up with the idea of bringing back the show, you had launched some pretty big news that summer that you were going to come back and write a Daredevil miniseries, which was a big deal. And so that was a really fun conversation that I was really excited to have with you. I think that the way I started that interview, I'd have to go back and listen to it, but I think the way I started it was basically saying, so you're officially calling it the Black Armor, are we? Because I remember, 8 years before, you were very vehement. It's not armor. And then there was this miniseries called Black Armor.
The minute sales insisted we call it black armor, I am shameless and was like, that's the best thing we could possibly call it. But if you've read the book, which I believe you have, you should have picked up on several instances where Matt kind of channels my attitude over the years, because I believe he says at least twice, I never called it that when people refer to it as armor. So, he does me some service there.
I did very much appreciate that, because it did feel like I could channel your voice, because I remember if I had one takeaway from that interview back in 2015, it's not armor.
Right. Because it was very much, this biomimetic, crazy sci-fi material, and Scott didn't interpret it as armor. He didn't draw it as armor. He didn't make it look like armor, but other folks, the only way they could interpret it in their minds, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes in the way they'd illustrate it, was kind of just one, just shy of having rivets in it. They made it bulkier and bulkier, and that was very much a disservice, I think, to the design. One of the flaws of the design ultimately was that Scott was one of the few people who could really pull off the lines of it and make it feel, that it was still moving with Daredevil as a character. And fortunately, Netho Diaz captured that with the miniseries, with the Black Armor miniseries, and made it very much his own, and both made it look formidable, but also captured, I think, that sense of motion. It was a real joy to see what he did with it.
One actually question that comes up there, so you bring up the idea that it's biomimetic, right?
Biomimetic, yes.
Okay. So it did feel like almost a drinking game, because like every episode, every issue, there's at least one or two mentions of it. But is this you making sure that people understand it's not armor and trying to reinforce this idea of what it actually is?
Yeah, a bit of that. And I think it's also, I think I learned a few things over the years, and that was why it was, for me, a kind of a gift to be able to come back to Daredevil and come back to play things out with what I believe are a much improved skill set. I mean, I had some skills back in the day. I have much better skills now. And, one of those things was just to be able to thread certain things through. There's the old thing that Jim Shooter used to say, Tom DeFalco would say, often every comic is somebody's first. And so while comics are marketed very differently, these days, I still wanted to make sure that essence of what this was threaded through this, so that if somebody picked up issue 2 or 3 or whatever, they still got a sense that this is something unique and not just, oh, look, it's Power Ranger Daredevil or something like that. One of the insults we got back in the day. And I always did think that the research that, we put into it was important, to think about what the materials would be that he would use and how they would still, work to the way that he operated as an adventurer and as a hero. And I always remember describing it in an interview that John Romita Jr. was in, because Fall from Grace, where the suit, the armor came out around the same time as Man Without Fear, the book he was doing with Frank Miller at the time. And so they were doing sort of like a group jam interview, and at one point they turned the interview over to me and said, Dan, tell us about the new costume. And I start describing it and the biomimetic technology and how it's based upon natural things and blah, blah, blah. And I look up and like JR is just looking at me like, and he literally says, "What are you smoking?" And it which I loved and, retained. So yeah, it was not meant to point out that, I'm not calling it armor. That was, the gag, as it were, that I put in there for folks who knew that over the years I had said it's not armor. It was more just to kind of establish, I think, the uniqueness of it and make sure that because the whole book was based somewhat on, bringing this, this suit that had been dismissed rather angrily, by some people and had not been seen except maybe on a trading card or whatever, maybe as a DLC in a video game, I think at one point, in over 30 years, I wanted to make sure that we were doing justice to it in a way. At one point I'd said to Devin Lewis, the editor, I might have said this in, the previous, interview, when we were talking about the genesis of the book, but, is is this a story about the armor, or is it just a story that happens to have the armor in it? And, so that conversation alone, influenced the way I would ultimately approach the whole story.
I'll definitely come back to that because I do kind of want to go back 30 years first and then come back to Black Armor. But one thing I think I must have mentioned this in the previous interview, but I will mention it again. So I first saw this particular costume of Daredevil, not in Daredevil at all, which is kind of a weird way to first come to it. I first came to it in Amazing Spider-Man 396, which was I think it was a gift I got for my birthday, and it was Mark Bagley drawing it. You had that version of Daredevil, and you had Spider-Man. It was right at the very beginning of the Clone Saga. It was like month 3, and so it always really stuck in my mind. And then when I grew up and got older, I was able to kind of hunt down those issues, and always really enjoyed those issues with McDaniel and what he was able to do with the art and really bringing those stories to life and having that to the point where everyone kind of knew that was kind of one of my favorite visuals of Daredevil. So when I was getting married, my groomsmen got me the Daredevil statue by Bowen, and there was a variant that had the black armor. So I had the black armor every day. It's in my in my dining area. There's a nice statue there, and it's Daredevil, and he's not in the yellow and red. He's not in the classic red. He's in the black armor. So I see it every day.
Oh my God, I didn't even know that existed. That's terrific. I just indulged in a purchase of and God, willing, it's as cool as it looks, but somebody actually made a custom minifigure, Lego minifigure, in the black armor, which, was, like I said, a little bit of an indulgence, but I was like, I gotta,
I'm shocked you wouldn't know that there was a Bowen statue. It's a very beautiful statue.
I will look for it. There's things I never saw. The suit was so angrily, like I said, dismissed by the editorial group that took it over, following. I mean, the issue that followed, me, being booted off the book, literally had them chopping the suit up, which was ridiculous. I think I was put off to it, over the years in a way, and not dismissive of what we had done, but, my radar was down. So when I would occasionally see like, oh, there's a Hildebrandt version of it, on a whatever, a calendar, or there's a poster of it, or there's a trading card, these are almost like surprises to me, that I had not, received or really knew about.
Makes sense. I do like that also that you said that your radar was down, and we're talking about Daredevil, so that's a very apt an apt word to use. So I appreciate that. So let's go back. I believe it's 96 or 97. We got Daredevil and Batman, a big one shot. This is back when Marvel was doing a lot of these one shots with DC. So I'm very curious because in terms of timing, like it's a couple years removed from you writing Daredevil. Daredevil's in a different place now. And I'm going to have a question that I think I answered my own question in my previous discussion of this last week with when I did the Book of the Month Club. But I'm curious, first of all, who approaches you and from which office? Are you getting approached on the Marvel side or the DC side? Who's kind of handling most of the production when this book goes to press? Right.
Well, I mean, I was the genesis of that book with Ralph Macchio, the editor. And what we had done was when Fall from Grace had come out, and Fall from Grace was a big deal, and it kind of given a little bit of a jolt to Daredevil more than they expected. We had a little bit of mojo going, and we used that mojo to start a lot of things in motion. We started the Elektra, miniseries that me and Scott would do. We had plans for several other Daredevil miniseries that were going to sort of almost create like a mini Daredevil pocket universe, if you will, to just kind of keep attention on the streets of Hell's Kitchen. And we had several things in the works. And amongst those, I put it to Ralph. I said, everyone's always comparing Daredevil and Batman and Daredevil. We knew they weren't the same character. But we said, we've got this stuff going on. Why don't we make this actually happen now? And Ralph was all for it. And he was good friends with Denny O'Neil, who was the Batman editor at one point. I believe Ralph had been Denny's assistant, so they had a friendship and a good working relationship. And as you said, in those days, they did these things more frequently. And a lot of that was because they didn't have the corporate overlords, and they could just literally pick the phone up and say, hey, want to do it? Sure. and then, walk down the hall to the publisher and say, hey, we're going to do this. They'd probably run the sales numbers, but Batman, Daredevil, sure, why not? You're not taking a big sales risk there. So that was kind of the way it was to happen. And to add a little more fire to it, we called Lee Weeks, who I had first teamed up with on Last Rites, the Fall of the Kingpin story. And Lee had been off the book, the character for a while, but that chance to do Batman and Daredevil, Lee was all over it. And so it looked like we had some fire to this. But then what happened was, they pulled Daredevil out of Ralph's office. They reassigned it, elsewhere. And everything kind of fell apart. All those miniseries went away. And Batman Daredevil kind of went into a little bit of a limbo. Ralph sort of maintained control of it in his office, probably because of the relationship with Denny, but it wasn't moving forward. And it wasn't moving forward enough that Lee couldn't get a commitment on time. Lee couldn't get a commitment on the rate that he had been, they had agreed to give him. So Lee stepped away. And the whole thing was kind of in this, will it happen, won't it happen? By that point, I was off the regular book, so everything was kind of very tenuous. And, but, finally it sort of reactivated, without a lot of fanfare, but we were able to kind of make it happen. I kept pushing, are we going to do this? We're going to do this. And finally, they were able to say, yeah, let's do it. And we were able to pull then Scott into it. And obviously Scott and I had a great relationship and a great partnership and a working relationship. So, Scott was not an also ran to Lee Weeks, just a different dynamic. But that was kind of the genesis of it. And it ended up being, a little rockier than it should have been. And I had to then overcome a couple of things in my own head to then, all right, get into the story. Because, it went from something that was on fire and I was already, really raring to go and, hyped up for to have it now sort of carry a little bit of baggage of why is it taking so long? Does Marvel even want to do this? Et cetera, et cetera. And that had to be kind of overcome through a couple of versions of the plot to get to the right one.
What is it like when you're thinking of a project and you have Lee Weeks in mind, and then now you're switched to McDaniel, who again, both brilliant artists, let's be fair, but very different artists and very different strengths in storytelling is very different. So do you have to kind of really reshape everything in your mind? I guess you were early enough maybe that you hadn't quite, as you said, kind of settled on the beats of the plot, but how much of it did you have to kind of adapt because you knew the storytelling sensibility was different than you had originally expected?
Yeah, we hadn't gotten any details on the plot, so there wasn't anything to kind of change or dismiss, but you're absolutely right. I had working with Lee would have been a different story, the rhythms of it, the feeling of it, the authenticity of the way he kind of, creates things. I think Scott's a little bit more fantastical, as you said, both great artists, and people I had really total trust in what they would do always, and never questioned their choices, and always felt that what they did elevated what I had tried to put through the construct of the plot. So if Lee had been the artist on it, I think there would have been a different dialogue and a different collaboration, and Lee's a bit more of a forceful personality sometimes. So, he might have had more to say, about, certain things. Not that Scott just went along for the ride, but, it's definitely a what if story. But it might have been, in other words, what if Lee Weeks had done this book? And I don't know the full answer to it. But I think it would have had, a little more grounded feeling to it, intense as Lee's work is very intense. But when I think of Daredevil and working with him on it, it's a much more street level experience, for me. And I've been lucky beyond with the artists I've worked with on so many things, and especially Daredevil. But, Lee will always be the Daredevil artist in my mind, just because of what we went through to get to that 300th issue.
Of course, which, I mean, someday if you're open to it, I would just sit down and talk to you about those 4 issues, because again, Last Rites has always been the story that is criminally under talked about, and I've always said this, that it's this perfect counterbalance to Born Again. It's this great bookend. It's just pitch perfect. So again, if you're ever willing to come back and chat about it, it's always been one of my favorites.
I would love to. Yeah, we'll make a date after this.
So questions. So I have many questions.
10 years go by. Yes, go.
Yeah,
go.
Yeah, exactly. Even as I just cracked the page and just kind of looking at the cover of Daredevil Batman, just on the intro page, I had some questions. And again, this is where I think it would be an editorial driven thing and not necessarily you, but when I was reading it with my co-host and we were doing this Book of the Month Club, we were so interested in the quick little bios that are given of Daredevil and Batman.
Yeah.
And then there's like a little bolded text, which is very interesting because I don't think of the way that they summarize. I was curious, was that an editorial thing? The editorial write that, or was that coming from you?
No, that opening page with all that setup was totally editorial. Like, and I think, probably based somewhat on the striking of an agreement between, Denny and Ralph and the editorial offices, and how it had to sort of be in a what if universe, Elseworlds universe, whatever it was. So that was all, I would sometimes write things for back covers or intros or, prefaces for certain books or set up things like that. But, I didn't have anything to do with that, that opening, page, as it were.
So it's interesting.
Did it strike you wrong? Did it feel like off, like coming into the way?
It was just a perspective I'd never taken. Like on Daredevil, it says, it's because he cares that Daredevil protects his city with such reckless idealism, which isn't necessarily wrong. It's just, I would never have thought of it in that way, especially with Daredevil. I don't usually think of as a reckless character, or I understand you're saying reckless idealism. Oh, you do? Okay, well.
I do. We could talk about that too, but keep going.
Well, it's interesting. So when we were reading this book, I felt at times that the way that Daredevil spoke felt very much the way that and this makes sense, the way you wrote him when he was wearing the black armor. Like he was an edgier character, not quite the Daredevil we'd had before, but he'd been through some stuff. And it was an interesting read because I almost felt like he was wearing the wrong costume to be acting the way that he had. Because he felt like that very particular version of Daredevil that I think does stand apart from some of the other interpretations over the years, but felt very authentic to that moment when he was in the black armor and going through all the stuff that he was going through there. So especially after, reading it and then reading Black Armor, the miniseries, it felt like that version of that character. He just wasn't wearing the costume. So that's the part that didn't throw me, but I was like, oh, it was interesting perspective because it felt like that's the way he was. But again, right. I don't usually think of him necessarily acting or speaking that way in the classic Red, but I definitely do see him that way in the armor, if that makes any sense.
It does, but I'll say to that, while I didn't have a concrete roadmap plan of what was going to happen between whenever I got booted off the book and 350 was coming up, and 350 would have been the next big milestone, and Ralph and I had touched on 350 being he gets back to the red costume. Like, we weren't going to destroy the armor, the black armor. He was going to probably put it in the Daredevil cave, or something like that. But, but he was going to get back to it, in the constant, screw up Matt Murdock's life and then put something back together, version of it. So in my head, there's an evolution to Matt that I picked up on it. Like, I went back into the book with the mindset of this is quote unquote my Daredevil, and I'm picking up, another phase of it. Here's another story I'm telling with him. And so I think it's natural, although the way that Daredevil Batman is written, I question some of my choices, there, and I'm not savvy enough to know exactly why I made some of the prose choices I made 30 years later right now, as much as I might know why I did what I did on Black Armor. But I felt that was that Daredevil. That was the Daredevil who had gone through, the Fall from Grace era, the Tree of Knowledge era, the wearing that costume, and then somehow getting back into it, which I wasn't part of. But the things about him, would have evolved and stayed true to my voice for him, And so that's the way I looked at it. I wasn't trying to kind of bend myself into pretzels of saying, well, I guess he can't have gone through what I put him through if he's here now over here. This is who I've chosen to make, to voice Matt with, voice Daredevil with, if that makes sense.
It does. And I do think I ultimately felt that way and came down that way. And it was interesting because it was an interesting way of both writing Matt as kind of having that swashbuckling kind of sense of humor, because there's still humor to him. And he's definitely playing with Batman, which is kind of fun to see because it's not typically the way people treat Batman. They don't usually treat him like they're not usually kind of having fun with them. It's interesting when I was reading this with my co-host, he was like, Batman's kind of a dick, and I'm like, yeah, but that's kind of the point, and that's also if very much of this time that would have been the Batman that we had, and I think I had maybe more of a handle on where Batman had been kind of around this period, how he had been portrayed. So I actually thought Batman was spot on because he's very much like, I'm better than you. I know what I'm doing. Like, get out of here.
Yeah.
And even at the end where he's like, telling Matt, like, just get the hell out of Gotham. Like, this is his town. He doesn't want other vigilantes running around his town. So I actually thought that was very accurate. I think he was thrown by it because he's not used to maybe Batman being that much of a bit of an asshole. But I thought that it was very in keeping with, this is my territory. I'm the guy who takes care of this. Don't get in the way of my investigation. Don't come to my home. Get out of my house. Is the way I felt, and I thought you did a good job portraying that.
And I love Batman. I never had a chance to write him, aside from this, but I mean, he was one of my formative, characters, heroes, growing up. So, but I think that sense of superiority has always been there, whether he's slugging Guy Gardner, in the Justice League or, that sense of superiority or whatever is part of the character, right? And he's the world's greatest detective, right? He's the guy who has nothing yet is always getting it over on everybody else. So, this whatever you are, whatever it is you do in your red suit and your horns, that whole attitude seemed perfectly appropriate to me. And I think, while I do not again think I wrote that opening stuff, I might have, but it doesn't feel like exactly like me. But I was on a panel with some other Daredevil folks at a convention, maybe a year or so ago, and a lot of them were talking about the devil in Daredevil, right? The dark side, the redemption thing, or just the dark side. The devil's always going to overtake him. And I realized, as I was talking to them, and I said this to the audience, and a couple of the folks there looked at me like, hey, you're crazy. But I think I've always played more with the reckless side of him than I have with the devil side of him. That swagger. That to me is a lot more powerful than this tortured devil figure, right? He's still tortured. And, as Devin Lewis said when we started Black Armor, make sure he suffers. And yes, he will suffer, Devin. Matt will suffer. Exactly. But I think, there is that quality of he's Daredevil, right? It's not just the devil part, it's the Daredevil part. And, he throws himself into situations, whether they're legal situations or physical altercations, not always knowing how he's going to get out of them. But ultimately there is at least in the stories that I do, and I really have enjoyed, there's a manipulative quality to him that he pulls these things off and he puts forces against each other as much as he has all these other abilities and these physical, skills, that is, creates these cascades of consequence. So I really like that reckless quality of him, which gets him in trouble, but also, succeeds, because the recklessness is not something that people expect. Standing in the road with the Batmobile coming raging down at him and, made you blink, it's like, that to me is, there's some, flaws to that story. I'd love to go back in and redo if I could, but there's a couple of very spot on things that I'll defend. That's one of them,
A question that had come up when we were reading this, on the other episode was we were very interested in the choice of villains, because I thought, Two-Face makes perfect sense, really being able to tie in. And this is something, actually, even going back further to a different Book of the Month club that we had done, we were marveling about how it was very interesting that, most of the crossovers that me and my friend had read were more in and around Marvel versus DC, like the actual big crossover, and whereas very much the idea that these two universes colliding and coming together. And so we hadn't read a lot of the older crossovers where they just, they were just on their own Earth, where, the new Teen Titans and the X-Men are on the same universe. There's no shenanigans to try and get them together. There's plot issues, plot ways to get them together, but we're not having to go between universes necessarily. And so we're kind of seeing that here where, Batman and Daredevil just occupy the same space. They're both in the same world. We just thought it was interesting because we were used to, in our minds, thinking that they were so separate and then crossovers would be some sort of bleed. But it's interesting to have a number of crossovers really just taking the central conceit that they're on the same world. They haven't really met each other. They kind of know about each other, and that's about it. What's interesting about this one as well is that it's the only time that I can tell where, and again, this was an editorial choice, not something you would have chosen, that on that opening text page, it also has the actual Elseworlds logo saying that this is what Elseworlds are, which obviously DC was already using Elseworlds at this time, but it is, from what I can tell, the only crossover that actually uses the Elseworlds tag, which I thought was curious.
Yeah, that I wouldn't have been, part of her decision, making, but I can see that as a, it's a safety net. It gets it out of the continuity police. It gets it out of having to worry about, do we ever have to do anything with this again? Do we have to acknowledge this anywhere? It's like that great opening to the last two issues of, the original Kurt Swan Superman run, and Alan Moore did that brilliant thing of, saying, it's a what if story, but aren't they all? So yeah, I mean, that's, I did not burden myself, if you will, with any of that. I just tried to tell a good story, and being able to get into it as quickly as possible without having to add an additional level of conceit that there's a portal or there's or a cross-dimensional rift or something like that. I mean, if that had come down as an editorial edict and Denny was to have said, well, that's the only way you can play with this. They've got to be somewhere else, literally, or you got to acknowledge that one doesn't exist with the other. Then obviously I would have done that. But instead I just got, notes like, the Batmobile does not drive on the open road. Fix this. Which was a very appropriate note, and, which led to the Batman line of like, what do you think I do? Drive this on the open road?
So I want to ask a question. So, I mean, obviously it makes sense to use Two-Face. He's kind of the perfect villain for this because you can build in a connection between Harvey Dent and Matt Murdock, which you do. I was really surprised that on the Marvel side we got Mr. Hyde, because it would not have been the type of villain I would have expected necessarily. Although as I was actually doing in the middle of recording the previous episode, I was actually seeing that it looked like Mr. Hyde was actually having quite a presence in Daredevil at the time. Again, you weren't the ongoing writer at the time, but he was in the Daredevil universe fairly prominently. There was a legal case that Matt Murdock was working on. He was his client. So I'm curious, did Marvel kind of come to you and say, use Mr. Hyde, we're kind of pushing him forward right now? Or what was the conversation? Because, one would think, we're going to bring these two universes together. Who are Daredevil's most prominent villains? You got, Elektra, Bullseye, or Kingpin. Like, those are usually the bigger three that we usually hear about, and not usually Mr. Hyde. So I'm curious if Mr. Hyde was the selection that you made, or for someone that had been suggested to you from editorial, or how this came about.
No, it's an excellent question. No, it was me. For thematic purposes, really. I mean, I didn't know what was going on in the regular Daredevil book at that point. I wasn't paying attention to it really. And nothing was put forward, to me that had to be it. I locked onto Two-Face because I think he's a great character. First and foremost, the Joker was oversaturated, even then. And so I did not want to do another Joker story, and Two-Face is such a strong character visually, conceptually. I think that's where I started with it. And then the lawyer, thing kicked in, and that just locked him into place. That was the super glue that put him right down. And that was my, for me at least, a gift from the universe, right? Like, they're both lawyers. Like, why wouldn't they know each other? Why can't they have history? So I was very pleased with that. I don't usually pat myself on the back, but I did on that one. And then, but the thematic aspect of a two-faced character and a duality character, a duality villain, going up against another duality villain, right? We always think of Hyde as just the big brute, but, the classic Hyde is the duality of Jekyll and Hyde, right? Or Calvin Zabo and Mr. Hyde, right? Zabo's not a nice character, but neither was Jekyll really. So that's what led me to him, I think initially was he fit the theme, very well. Now, my disservice to Hyde was I did not explore that as, deeply or thematically as I should have after making that decision. He does become sort of a plot device. He becomes this like incubator, that Two-Face is manipulating, throughout, versus really kind of playing with that, duality, good, evil, type of aspect of him. But that's where, it came out of, was the best intentions of trying to make the book have that thematic aspect to it.
When you are writing a crossover like this, like obviously you have to serve two masters. I mean, you're serving two different companies. Was that something that was at times kind of more of a struggle to make sure there was a balance, or how much of a discussion was there about, you hear about the Fast and the Furious movies, about how, they have to have a certain amount of lines for like The Rock and a certain amount for Vin Diesel, and they have to kind of be fair and they have to like throw the same amount of punches, it sounds so ridiculous, but like there's very specific ideas that go in to make it quote unquote fair for those two people. When you're playing with two different companies, I would imagine it's probably not that dissimilar. So how much discussion was there to make sure there was kind of an even narrative handedness in terms of, was it, and did it actually get that detailed about like how many pages is Daredevil, how many are Batman, and how much of the focus, like, did it get that in depth, or was it really a little bit more hands off?
There were some very specific notes, from Denny especially. And I was intimidated by Denny, although Denny, was a very nice guy, but I didn't know him that well. I didn't know him as well as Ralph. Denny's reputation, my awe of Denny, if you will, probably put me a little bit like back, from it, because Denny was my formative Daredevil writer, right? So many of my early stories that I was, fell in love with Batman around were written by Danny O'Neill. But all the notes were fair, and they were not like, they were not like scoldy, negative notes or anything like that. But I think I came into it, while I'm again 30 years later and much better at a lot of things. I tried to take myself seriously even then, or take my job seriously, even then, maybe that's a better way of putting it. And, so I looked at I had been an editor, and I had taken that seriously. I was, a writer, I took that seriously. So I felt it was my responsibility to make sure this wasn't a Daredevil story that Batman happened to show up in now and again. Or look, Daredevil gets it over on Batman, totally. And because I'm the Daredevil writer or was the Daredevil writer, and that's the character I know better. So I took it upon myself to really try to balance, the scenes, the play-by-play, the comeuppance, between them, as much as anything else. So, you get the scene where, it's made you blink with the Batmobile where, Daredevil, edges out Batman a little bit. You get Daredevil being full of himself on the rooftop and, Batman, microanalyzing his every move and immediately assessing what he's all about. You've got sensory perceptions and this, that, and the other thing, so who are you fooling? Not me. So there was that aspect to trying to always keep it balanced. And even toward the end, as it's getting toward the final moments, a balance of what's Matt Murdock, Daredevil's perception of Harvey Dent, what's Batman's perception of Harvey Dent. They each got equal time to sort of arrive at the final climax. And even though Daredevil sort of edges it out a little bit by recognizing there's a little bit more of Harvey left, it's still Batman who has to reach over because the damn thing's color-coded, at the end. And for all Matt's skills, that would have been the undoing if, the Dark Knight wasn't there to click the right button. So I took it upon myself to try to treat it as a Batman Daredevil story, or whatever the listing is, Daredevil Batman, whatever the title order is. That was my goal, and I think I achieved it, because that was certainly nothing that came back saying, well, you've made this too much of a Batman story or too much of a Daredevil story, and, it seemed to strike the right balance, for everybody involved.
Was there, when you were doing it, was there any question in your mind that the action was going to take place in Gotham instead of New York?
That I can't remember. I think that would have been really interesting, and it's certainly if that tease at the end had ever played out, and we would have gone to Gotham.
We were in Gotham, right?
No, we were in New York City. No, we were in New York City. Yeah. Okay. But we would have gone to Gotham because I would love to have done like Matt's sensory perceptions of Gotham. Like, what the hell does Gotham feel like and smell like, and and all those things. That would have been a complete mind, screw job, to play out all those new sensations. Even though Matt's been places and been to cities, you have to presume that Gotham has a very unique sensory immersion zone, if you will. And that could have been something to play out, really interesting. But I think in that case, I did default to New York because I knew New York better, and it felt right. That gave a little bit of an edge to, Daredevil's world.
When you speak about, having a very conscious decision to try and make sure that you are kind of giving equal airtime and that you are being fair and balanced, I did in that context. I guess when they finally defeated the villains, they both kind of deliver a zinger, but at the same time. Because you have Two-Face say, that was simply the last of Harvey Dent, and then both Daredevil and Batman at the same time say that, then rest in peace. And that felt very like, that makes sense. You're kind of letting them both have the button, at the same time, as opposed to having one over the other. So it makes sense to kind of do that at the same time simultaneously. I also just like that as a closer. My co-host talked about that. Like, the next time we play like a cooperative board game with our other friend who doesn't know what's going on, if we win, we'll just be like, then rest in peace. And
then rest in
happening.
Peace. Exactly. Exactly.
You got to read Batman Daredevil.
I love it.
Any final thoughts on this? Because I don't want to give short shrift to Black Armor, but we only have about an extra 20 minutes or so, and I do want to get into Black Armor. Any final thoughts about this amazing one shot?
No, and if you want to stay a little bit longer, I'm okay. It's your schedule as much as mine. But I mean, I will say, I'm very happy with the book. I mean, 30 years later, I'm not always happy with things. I've become more happy over time, but I do think it really, among the Batman Daredevil, team ups, of which I believe there are 3, I think it holds its own. I think it does a great job. I think it was a good standard bearer to start things off with. So, again, I could nitpick, certain choices I made and certain structural things, but all told, I'm really very pleased with the Dent-Murdoch connection and how it sort of drives things through. If in anything, that gives a little bit more weight to Daredevil. But if folks have not seen it, it's I believe it's worth checking out, and it sounds like you do too. So there's 2 votes for it, 3 with your co-host.
Question. Well, before I actually leave it for a second. How surprising was it to you to hear that Marvel versus DC was going to be doing a collection? Like, we were going to get a collection of all these crossovers, and that this was going to be recollected for an audience who maybe didn't see it 30 years ago. Like, how did it surprise you that this omnibus came out that has this particular book in it?
No, I mean, what surprised me is they wouldn't send me one, because they said it was too expensive and I didn't have enough pages in it to count, which I was
wow,
a little sour grapes on that, yes. But no, I mean, there are lots of great stories, right? There are lots of great, crossover stories, and I'm frankly surprised, they haven't done it before. Again, I know they're big corporate organizations now, so it's much, much harder to navigate, but, these are fun stories, and by and large, even the ones that are, frothy, if you will, they're just kind of like popcorn stories, were always well executed with well done art. Everyone always seemed to take it very seriously, and from an adventure and a fan of the character's point of view, it makes perfect sense, to have these out there, and recognize, the talents and the joy, if you will, that these people had in creating these.
Absolutely. So 26 years later, you write some more Daredevil and Daredevil Black Armor.
Yes.
One thing I have to point out that I really enjoyed about this, and I mean, obviously there has in general been a wave of, I hate this term, nostalgia miniseries, but I guess that's usually how they get lumped together. There's been a lot of creators coming back to Marvel, doing stories set in specific time periods, etc. So this is not the first that we've seen of this style. What I really appreciated about yours is how you really felt more lived in with the world. Like, it really took advantage, as you said, of kind of continuing the story, and taking place in that particular world, and not telling something that was just insular. It felt like you could very easily pull on these threads and, see where some of these characters are later and where some of the things go. So it definitely felt that you played in that type of sandbox. Hearing your affinity for Mr. Hyde makes sense, how we get to see a little bit of Mr. Hyde in here as well, playing an interesting role. Obviously you had a lot of history with Strucker as well. Obviously he had been in Daredevil before during Last Rites. Obviously you'd written him in I guess S.H.I.E.L.D., right?
S.H.I.E.L.D., yep.
So it's interesting to kind of look at this and see the elements that you're pulling from other places, and kind of pulling them together. Again, this feels very of a specific time in Matt's life, but it feels lived in. And so you're not just kind of just telling the plot story. There's a lot of characterization as well that I almost think you didn't even have to go so hard on it. even the case of, Matt trying to help the guy who wants to be a lawyer himself, try and help others, that's a really compelling arc, but it's almost like it didn't even, and I mean this in the nicest way, it almost didn't even need to be here. Like, it's adding so much more richness to Matt's life and what he's trying to do as he's figuring out who Jack Batlin really is. So I really appreciated it on that level.
Well, thank you. And you nailed so many things there. And I had not thought of the lived in sort of label, but I love that. I love that sort of, feeling about it. And there's different things that came naturally, with the story as I kind of got into it. And I would say I wrote about 80% of what were the bones of it in one hot summer afternoon.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I really did sort of have this, because and that's how C.B. Cebulski had pitched it to me. He pitched it to me as a nostalgia book. So your labeling is right. Because they came up to me at the convention and said, we've had success with these nostalgia books. Would you be interested in doing one? Before I then had the chance to meet with Devin and Tom and start to talk about what it would really be, I was just starting to germinate on things. And, as I started to kind of sketch things out, just moments sort of started to come to me and they started to assemble together, which is great. You're sort of, again, attuned to something. And I think and that's become a much more organic way that I've, turned to writing over the years. And I think that allowed me to sort of hew into not Dan's best of things, but things that felt legitimate to me about Matt's world and characters and moments that would make sense to contribute to continuing this story. I had gone out to lunch with Fabian Nicieza, when they, had brought this up to me, and his advice to me was, not that I was looking for advice, but Fabian is never shy about giving advice. And I love Fabian. But he said, write it as if you never stopped writing it, which I thought was wonderful, right? You never stopped writing the book. No one took anything away from you. No one stopped your stride. Just go right back to it. And very different person that I am now to go back in and do it. A better writer, I think, by many leagues. But that was just such a great validation or whatever to be able to go in and then start to pick these things that were my lived in moments, right? The way he interpreted senses, the way he talked about senses. The Kingpin scene is somewhat superfluous to the story. But it's lovely. I love it. I love the byplay between the two of them. I love, that acknowledgement and that knocking, in the ribs and talking about, King's Fall and, things like that. There's just little things like that felt wonderful. And I had one person say, I think it was actually Kuljit Mithra, who runs the wonderful Man Without Fear website, like how surprised he was to see Elektra and Karen show up. He hadn't expected them, even though they have like a half-page scene each. But, to me, they were the world, right? And they were, you talk about the one character who wants to become a lawyer but has all these issues, and Matt has to help him. One of the tricks that one of the roadblocks rather, that I had set up for myself with the whole Jack Batlin identity back in the day was, well, how does he recognize better that he needs both sides of himself, right? How does he recognize he's given up the lawyer side of himself with this persona, but he desperately needs the lawyer side of himself to counterbalance the vigilante side of himself. And that's one of the things I was going to explore between, Matt Murdock faking his death and then probably revealing he's still alive by 350 or whatever. And I hadn't figured it out. But this allowed me to figure it out, right? This little street law thing he sets up, which allows him to play out being a lawyer, was important to making that lived-in world come to life and making it feel like this wasn't. I mean, it's a frothy adventure. It's not like it's not an epoch changing story. But for me, it was a validation that there was more adventures that happened with this black armor than anybody had thought about, right? A lot more happened in between the time I left the book or was removed from the book in Felix Unger speak, and them chopping the suit up, right? There were all these other adventures. And so that was a chance, with those things like his street lore organization to bring those to life, and having a character like that he had to help advise, that started to prove things out and brought that world to life more for me. At least that was, again, part of the organic, things. And Hyde wasn't originally in my outline, either, even though I do like Hyde, but that was actually my good friend Greg Wright, had read an earlier draft of the plot and knew where I was going. And he said, what you really need is a cornerman. And he had me watch a movie with Brian Dennehy, which was, a fight movie. And that really made me feel like that was a necessary part of the story I didn't have. And that's where then I pulled Zabo Hyde out as both, he's the cornerman, and he's also the out of control element that, that Matt Daredevil like recklessly inserts into the middle of everything, right? He hands over the formula to Zabo, and it's like, go for it. Like, screw these guys up, I mean, how does it get more reckless than that? Like unleashing the Mole Man and and Hyde just so we can get those people out of there. I mean, that's reckless as reckless does.
I'm curious because it's interesting. You bring up the idea that, originally you didn't have, the idea necessarily of the cornerman. I'm curious because obviously a thorough line through the miniseries is you have these flashbacks to, Fogwell's gym and Matt being outside and basically getting to learn from his father, even though his father doesn't even know, which I thought was a great touch. And I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff. I really like fathers and sons. I really like their complicated relationship. I like kind of seeing how he's trying to be like his dad, but again, can't let his dad know about it. So I like this running plot throughout, and then it really means a lot by the end because it's all about ring that bell, I'm ready to go. And we've been building up to it through the entire time. I'm curious, how early in your plot was it there as this kind of running flashback to kind of guide the character and his mental state?
That wasn't there originally either, but by the time I constructed the whole plot, it was there, so, I had the hard, big things about people are vanishing from Hell's Kitchen, they're being, at one point I had them being taken away to an oil rig thing offshore, that was like a kind of a fight club, thing being hosted there. And Devin was like, just bring it back to Hell's Kitchen. Spot on. I had most, if not all, the major beats of the plot, but then as the fighting aspect of it, the Squid Games Fight Club, whatever aspect of it, started to solidify, then that's when you start to layer on the richness, the character richness, the guy you were saying who's, looking for his law, future. He has one, pulling in Randy, who is this, this woman character who I'd always intended to sort of become a romantic interest for Horn Dog Murdoch, but she never had a chance to grow, but making her become something more of a foil. But the aspect of the father, we always think of Maggie a lot, his presumed mother, as somebody Matt's interacted with. But I had never, and I did some scenes with that in some of the stories I wrote, but I never really worked out, the father aspect and the fact that he had taken this faux name of Jack Batlin, right? Battling Jack Murdoch and reversing it up because I was so clever. That again that tied into the story. Suddenly that snapped certain things together for me. And that device of opening each book with that little mini scene, which added something to it, was, just a nice nod to the whole, I'm going to use your term again, the lived-inness of it. But it also got, to me, to this moment, where, and Netho did such a brilliant job by adding Jack Murdoch to the background of it, where he slugs, Strucker, and describing that scene as like, I think I wrote it like this is, stands among the greatest punches in all of comics history. And I listed a bunch of them, and Netho, I think, certainly delivered, on it. But, the line I wrote there, it was even in the plot, before the script, which was, something like, although it's been many years, I see my father's face again. And I was writing that for my father, as much as I was writing it for Matt. I mean, that was like, that it became a father-son story, that was enriched for me by thinking about my father who died, like 12, 13 years ago. And I gave it over to Matt. I wasn't trying to imprint myself into it, but I think that again made the story richer than I would have expected, when I started it.
Now, are you saying that Netho came up with the idea of having like the specter of Jack behind Daredevil as he gives that punch, or was that in the plot that the specter of Jack is behind him?
He added that because what I had was I had a little the way I'd written it was like a little like whatever flashback moment there, where he's winding up for the punch and it was just Jack, sort of advising on the type of punch to land to really knock somebody, knock a superior opponent out. But Netho did the added effect of adding that ghost image behind him, so, they're both essentially like slugging. That wasn't that, I gave him the splash. I said the splash is the greatest punch ever in comics, go to town, open it up, but I did not, say overlay Jack Murdoch in the background. That's one of the joys of working with somebody like Netho, but also one of the joys, I think, of working in that plot system with somebody talented like that, where you get, my plots are, I think, very detailed. I look through and I try to hit all the visual beats and I put a lot of dialogue and such in there. But you get moments like that are just, full on surprises that, just take you to some other place. When he did the Mole Man breaking out of the cage, that was there as in the plot, but, his visualization of that just, took the dialogue, to a whole different level of fun and verve and swerve and that kind of thing.
What Netho does with Daredevil using both the combination of the billy clubs and then performing them into the staff, which is, again, something very specific to the Black Armor kind of version in terms of some of the versatility that we saw and what McDaniel did as well. I'm curious, how much direction were you giving him, if any, about kind of how to manipulate when it's going to be the billy clubs, when it's going to be the staff? Like there's that great sequence, I believe, in the first issue where he jumps onto a vehicle, he smashes into it while he's got the staff out. He jumps off of it. Now you have Sabretooth against him. Now he disconnects it and throws it, and then you have two different projectiles that hit Sabretooth. I'm curious, like, how much in your plot is describing, like, how he's manipulating these, or how much of that did you leave up to Netho?
No, I was fairly specific about that. I mean, that's me thinking through the choreography. I mean, Netho's, adding a whole different layer to it, but I'm trying to figure out the beats and how the beats land on pages and, giving hopefully some unique action and there was, I had my little action figures. So I'm trying to how the hell is this going to happen? There's, I think, the third issue, which is just a beast of an issue. It's like, it's exhausting to read, and what Netho's, and poor Netho, this was originally 5 issues, written as 5 issues, and then we had to collapse it down to 4, and the third issue probably took the biggest beating in terms of pacing and size. But I believe that's the one where Sabretooth and Hobgoblin are like coming down the corridor at Daredevil, and Daredevil's like running, he's not deviating, he's running right into them, and he sort of, he snaps the staff together, he pings them in the head with the billy clubs, he grabs the billy clubs, he snaps the staff together, he slams them in the throat, he he vaults over the top of them and then slams their throats down to the floor and, and then just keeps going. Like, he never stops, but he does this elaborate, like, hit, choke, slam, I mean, I like took my little action figures and like, he hits them there and he moves there and he does that. And then I, described it as best I could, to Netho. But, that Netho just plussed it, by 1,000 by, what he turned that into. But I try to give him, something to work with, something to plus and something to go to a different place with, and quickly learned, to trust what he was doing. But I don't think there's anything worse. And I saw this as an editor and page 1 to 15, they fight. I've seen literally plots like that. And maybe that gives a lot of license to an artist, but I think that's pure laziness. and I do not want to be lazy on this in any way, shape, or form.
A sequence I really enjoyed, and I think part of why I enjoyed it is I think you play with expectations, because I believe I'm trying to remember, I think it's the third issue, where you have Matt stepping into the ring and you have all sorts of supervillains jumping in. And I think I was like, well, that's a lot of guys, and some of these are like real heavies. How's this going to play out? And then you do such a great job of, as you said, kind of using your corner man to, he's been working, Zabo's been down there. He knows the beatings that different characters have taken. He knows where they're vulnerable. So he can just say that off to the side. Daredevil can hear him because he's obviously using his senses. And he's got this leg up so he can attack all the vulnerable spots on these people. So even though they may at times be outside of his weight class, so to speak, he's able to quickly and efficiently take them out because he's got this upper hand. So I really enjoyed how you kind of played with expectations there, and also just a really smart use of both enhanced hearing and, again, having Zabo not really liking the spot he's stuck in, and he's trying to help Daredevil so they can get out of here. So I just thought that was a really well done series of sequences, because it was just really fun to see how Daredevil can, somehow hold his own against, Batroc and Tarantula and Lady Deathstrike and all these people, and you kind of build it in very nicely so that it feels very organic.
That's great. That's good. That's good to hear. Until, of course, Strucker pulls everybody else out and says, team up and, beat the blind guy. But, but that's also something, I recognized or deconstruct it, for myself, some of the things I think I'm good at with, Daredevil, with some things I might have just done before more intuitively because I was younger and, simultaneously arrogant and suffering from imposter syndrome. But, but I think the strategic quality of Daredevil is something worthwhile to think about, and by that I mean, he is when he actually does lawyering, when he's not being totally reckless or not showing up for court and leaving Foggy to do all the work, Matt's got to be a really smart lawyer. He is a really smart lawyer. And so that quality of him, plays into that strategy. And that's where I was leading into that cornerman aspect, where, he recognizes who Zabo is, and then says, and then plays at him. He plays at the ego, plays at the sense of haughtiness and everything, and, lures him in, to it. That's strategy, right? That's the line is something like, I just have to introduce doubt. I don't have to, the perfect defense attorney thing, right? I don't have to prove my point. I just have to introduce doubt. And that's what he does to get Zabo over to his and the side of the people that he wants to get out of there.
I do want to come back for a second to, you made the comment about Kuljit Mithra really liking how, you did use characters that he would not have expected to see, like Elektra, like Karen Page. And again, to go back to the idea of it making feel very lived in to a specific time and in your previous run, that's one of those things where it's like a subplot. It doesn't end up necessarily having to be anything. It's just showing you that there's additional depth to this world, over and above what we see. Big question that I had for you is that, in the first couple pages, you have that great 2-page splash where you have elements of what would have been an Elfin Grace and Tree of Knowledge. Yes. And that's a lot of elements to try and, boil down into a 2-pager. And there's a lot of heavy lifting that it's trying to do. And I'm curious, I think on the one hand, you could almost go overboard with text because there's so much to unpack. So obviously you really were trying to, I guess, really be very deliberate in the words that you did use to not overwhelm one's senses, so to speak, in terms of all the different stuff you're throwing at us, but instead letting the art kind of do the heavier lifting about, showing us pieces of each of these stories and just kind of giving quick, like capsule snapshots, in some cases just a couple words.
Right.
How many permutations of that did you maybe go through, or like how trying was it maybe to try and how do I boil this down, have a way to get us where we need to go, kind of similar to what I said about Daredevil Batman, not having to take a lot of time with setup, just kind of letting this go and play, but also I do have to recognize that this is a very specific period, and this isn't the Matt Murdock we're used to seeing. He's not literally going by Matt Murdock at all. He's someone else. In terms of so how much work was it for you to kind of sit down and figure out how do I do this in as concise a way as possible?
That's a great question. You got to interview me more, Adam. Your questions are excellent. Not that I have much to talk about, but I'll tell you a funny story before I answer your question. At least I think it's a funny story. So, the genesis of this project, and I say this in all respect to the editorial office, who I really enjoyed working with. There were huge gaps of time, like in between me turning into a plot, the whole plot, hearing anything at all back, writing another version of the plot on my own because I recognized there were things I still want to add to it and sending it to them and saying, hey, I changed it, hearing back a couple of notes from them and then accommodating those and then turning it in. Like months would go by, right? Like where I didn't hear anything back. I was sending, funny, like emails with subject lines like, special, from Fisk Spices, free legal advice from Nelson and Murdoch, anything to get their attention. And then one day I get this email with no context, like from Tom, the associate editor, and, but there's no like header to it or anything. It just had the first 6 pages, which included that spread, as the attachment, and sort of I just opened it up like, what is this? And looking at it, and like there was that sense of like deja vu familiarity, like, I know this. Where do I know this from? Oh, I wrote this. Holy shit, it's the book. And so, like, I didn't know Netho from Adam. I didn't know his work. I didn't know he had been assigned to the book. And I didn't even know that they had approved the plot, right? So all of a sudden, like, it just appears. And, that's an example of, where the magic and what he did with that spread, which I had sort of described as like, it's a movie poster. It's like all the Fall from Grace. And, in one, you see this, he's jumping off a rooftop and, he's surrounded by these different vignette images. So, I put it all out there, but he just, he went to town on that. He just turned it into something incredible. So, the one problem I had in probably scripting the book, was making sure I didn't fall into the old bad habits where I would overwrite things, which I did from time to time. So that brevity of language to just hit the right beats, hopefully the right beats, I believe they're the right beats, was an exercise in, if I ever felt that old stuff coming around, I'd walk away from the screen. I would just leave it, and not come back until I felt like I was, sort of refreshed. But by and large, I knew the problem I had set myself up for. The problem I had set in motion 30 years ago was, this Matt Murdock is Jack Batlin conceit, and yet backed myself into a corner. And as I said in my first draft, that thing I wrote on that summer afternoon and, it sent to those guys is like, what about this? I said, nobody wants to read a Jack Batlin story. I don't want to write a Jack Batlin story, but he is in this place in time and we are not moving out of it. All the time I have is in between the last issue I wrote and all these many, many adventures he had in the Black Armor, and then they destroyed the Black Armor. So it's not even like there's a place in time I could say, oh, it's a Black Armor story, but it's like after he's Matt Murdock again. So I knew I had to establish where he was and what had happened, but I wanted to do it as economically and I guess more conceptually as possible versus kind of having to get into like excruciating detail. There was a time where there was this and I did this and this happened and then I died and blah, blah, blah. So, thankfully Netho's art supported that. All those elements were in my description, but it just felt right to kind of keep it brief and to the point, and a little fall from grace nod, that type of thing as a little bit of a needle drop. And doing where he walks through Times Square, in the scene after, you get to see the two sides of him. You get to see the Batlin side, the Murdoch side. So, and then just move on, right? Again, get into the lived-inness of this world and make the adventure move forward versus him being tortured over it, or spending too much time. And then again, once I found the street legal angle, that allowed me to then bring in the lawyer side that I knew I needed and solve for the things that Matt would have been missing otherwise. Netho's art was a gift and heavily influenced my wanting to do it justice with just the right amount of language and not, crazy overblown stuff.
A particular splash that I'm glad you gave to Netho was Iron Man and his modular armor. Fans of a certain era such as me, have a very strong affinity to that particular armor. So being able to see quite the money shot of him showing up and then having him still for another panel in that armor was a really nice touch. So thank you for letting him draw that.
Yes, no, that was he was always there, even in the original thing. There was an Iron Man, and doing that line again. You call that armor? I never called it that. And and he was perfect, obviously, for that. And Len Kaminsky actually sent me a thank you note for bringing the modular suit back in, because Len,
that's funny,
created that. But there's little bits like that, not survive from the outline, but those were again more plot driven moments. But as I started to kind of find that cadence of, I never called it armor. It just plays out nicely. It bookends the story in a fun way, and probably works better when you read the whole thing in the little trade paperback collection, even than reading over the 4 issues.
So I'm going to let you get back to your evening in just one moment before I hopefully have you come back in a few months to talk about Last Rites. But what can you tell us about what you're working on right now?
Well, a few things. Thank you for the time to chat it up. Speaking of Last Rites, if we'll start with there, I have a newsletter which folks can find at storymaze.substack.com, and if you subscribe to the newsletter, which is free, you actually get my original proposal for Daredevil, the thing that won me the assignment, and so that talks about like that whole run up to taking down the Kingpin. It's kind of a time capsule artifact, that folks might get a kick out of. If anyone is in the Richmond, Virginia area, next week or week after, rather, I think it is. Maybe it's next week. GalaxyCon, 26th through the 30th, I believe. I'll be down there. So folks would like to come say hi in person. If you show up with a copy of any copy of Black Armor, the first autograph of that person is free. First person I see with that, not every first person. And if you show up in Black Armor cosplay, you'll get a full set of the original Fall from Grace storyline.
That's pretty enticing for people of a certain type.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, originally this episode was going to go out on the 29th, but I feel like it's going to have to come out a couple days earlier so people can get their cosplay together fast.
I have to feel like with 3D printers, somebody can put together a kick-ass Black Armor cosplay.
Probably right.
I have a Kickstarter project in pre-launch, which is the second issue of a supernatural sort of Truckers from Hell story that I'm having a lot of fun with. If folks go to tinyurl.com/Axles Infernal, AXLESINFERNAL. It's a preview site. You can see the trailer. You can see the art. No commitment, but if you sign up, it helps us generate some interest around it and get to the point where we can launch this thing. Folks, I think we'll have some fun with it. They had fun with the first issue. And then at the end of April, from Black Box Comics, which is a small publisher with a lot of fun stuff, I have a book called Risk coming out, RYSK, which is a cyber heist thriller adventure. A lot of slashes in there, but it's a near future, energetic, AI influence type story that it's a little bit of a different, plays off some of my digital technology interests, but having a great time with Mannix Francisco is the artist on that. And folks can find that hopefully in their store at the end of April if Diamond ships it. And go into your store right now and ask for it so they order it. So a few things.
Sounds like you're quite busy, yeah.
Yeah, and that's not even the stuff that pays the bills. So, but yeah, that's good stuff.
Dan, thank you so much for coming back and chatting about these projects. And again, I will definitely make sure to have you back on, and it will not take 8 years, hopefully, to get you back. But as I said, these were fun projects, very different from each other, very different. Also, obviously, the artistic talents were very different, both very high quality, but very different terms of style. So it was interesting to see how you work kind of melded together with the art in different ways. So anyways, these were a lot of fun. It was a real pleasure being able to chat with you about them, and I look forward to having you back sometime in the near future.
Thank you again, Adam. This has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time to, dig into these and, hit me with some really, thoughtful questions. It's a great chance to reconnect.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right.